They offered him cash to disappear until his dog uncovered the secret buried beneath the farmhouse floor. A homeless Navy SEAL inherited a farmhouse. Everyone avoided. His dog found what they hid inside. Snow covered the Bitterroot Valley, like a warning no one wanted to read. Caleb Turner stepped off a bus with nothing but a duffel bag and a scarred German shepherd at his side. The farmhouse waiting for him stood alone against the mountains, silent and unwanted. But when Atlas began digging beneath the floorboards, the past didn't just surface, it roared back to life. Comment 1 if you'd stand your ground, 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. The bus groaned as it climbed the last stretch of highway into Bitterroot Valley, its engine straining against the cold Montana air. Snow dusted the shoulders of the road, not heavy enough to cover the earth, just enough to remind anyone watching that winter was settling in for good. Inside, the heater rattled uselessly above Caleb Turner's head. He sat near the back, one hand resting on the worn canvas leash wrapped loosely around his wrist. At his feet lay Atlas. The German shepherd's coat, once deep black and tan, now showed streaks of gray around the muzzle. His ears were upright, alert even in stillness. His amber eyes tracked every movement in the aisle. Combat had taught him that calm never meant safe. Caleb hadn't shaved in days. His beard had grown uneven, and the hollow beneath his cheekbones told the story of too many skipped meals. His navy duffel bag rested between his boots. Everything he owned fit inside it. A few clothes, a flashlight, a folded American flag from his father's funeral, discharge papers, nothing else. The bus lurched over a pothole. The sudden jolt snapped something loose inside his chest. For half a second, the world shifted. The rattle of metal became rotor blades. The hiss of brakes became incoming fire. The flicker of fluorescent lights turned into muzzle flashes in desert dust. His breathing changed. Atlas noticed before anyone else. The dog lifted his head and nudged Caleb's knee, firm, deliberate, not playful, not gentle, a grounding signal. Caleb blinked hard. He pressed his palm against Atlas's neck, fingers sinking into the thick fur. "I'm good," he murmured, voice low. Atlas didn't look convinced. He stayed pressed against him until Caleb's breathing steadied. Outside the window, the mountains rose like dark guardians along the horizon, jagged peaks dusted in white. Pine forests stretched in long, quiet lines beneath them. The land looked empty, untouched, unforgiving. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom. "Bitterroot, last stop." The bus sighed as it pulled into the small station, a single concrete platform beside a gas station with a flickering sign. No crowds, no taxis, just wind scraping across pavement. Caleb stood slowly. His knees felt older than 35. Atlas rose with him, shoulders brushing Caleb's leg, body positioned slightly forward, protective posture. The other passengers avoided eye contact as they shuffled past. They saw the jacket, the duffel, the dog. They made quiet assumptions. The doors folded open. Cold air rushed in like a slap. Caleb stepped down first, boots crunching against thin ice. Atlas followed, scanning the parking lot, then the roofline, then the tree line beyond the road. The bus doors shut behind them with a heavy thud, and just like that, they were alone. The engine roared back to life, and the bus pulled away in a cloud of exhaust, leaving Caleb and Atlas standing on the cracked platform. The silence settled quickly. Small-town silence. The kind that feels like it's watching you. Across the street, a wooden sign swung above a diner. Holloway's. Its windows glowed warm against the gray afternoon. A pickup truck rolled slowly past, the driver glancing at Caleb a second too long before looking away. Caleb adjusted the strap on his duffel and pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket. Martha Green, attorney at law. He unfolded the letter again, even though he knew it by heart. You have been named sole beneficiary of the estate located at 114 Turner Road, Bitterroot Valley, Montana. He barely remembered his uncle, a tall man with calloused hands and quiet eyes. They hadn't spoken in over a decade, and yet now Caleb was here. Homeless, exhausted, standing at the edge of land that supposedly belonged to him. Atlas sniffed the air, then looked up at Caleb as if asking the same question Caleb had been avoiding since the letter found him at a veterans' shelter in Spokane. Why here? The wind picked up, tugging at Caleb's jacket. He glanced toward the diner again. Warm light, coffee, human voices. His stomach tightened. He hadn't eaten since morning. They crossed the street. The bell above the diner door chimed as they entered. Conversation dipped for a heartbeat. Forks paused, eyes lifted. A few patrons turned back to their plates. One older man at the counter kept staring. Atlas stayed close at Caleb's left leg, posture controlled but alert. Not aggressive, just ready. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 40s, hair tied back, sleeves rolled above strong forearms. Her name tag read, Grace. She took in the scene in one glance. The duffel, the dog, the worn boots, the guarded eyes. Afternoon, she said gently. Caleb nodded. You serve coffee? Best in the valley. He managed the faintest trace of a smile. They slid into a booth near the window. Atlas settled under the table but kept his head visible, ears angled toward the room. Caleb wrapped his hands around the mug when it came. The heat seeped into his palms. Grace lingered. You passing through? She asked. Something like that. She looked toward the mountains visible beyond the glass. You hear about the Turner place? The words landed heavier than the coffee. Caleb looked up slowly. That obvious? She hesitated, then nodded once. People talk. What do they say? Grace didn't answer right away. Her eyes softened slightly. They say no one stays there long. Atlas's ears twitched. A spoon clattered somewhere behind them, too loud. Caleb's shoulders tensed automatically before he caught himself. Grace noticed. You military? She asked quietly. He nodded. Thank you, she said simply. No politics, no questions. That steadied him more than she probably knew. Grace set the check on the table but didn't push it toward him. First cup's on the house. Caleb swallowed. Appreciate it. When she walked away, he stared out the window again. Snow had begun falling lightly, thin white threads against dark pine. Atlas shifted closer, resting his chin against Caleb's boot. Caleb exhaled slowly. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe he'd sign whatever papers needed signing and take whatever money came with it. A motel room, a few months of stability, somewhere warmer. But something about the mountains unsettled him, and not in a bad way, more like a memory trying to surface. The door chimed again. A tall man in a tailored coat stepped inside, snow clinging to his shoulders. He scanned the diner quickly before his eyes landed on Caleb. Just a flicker. Too quick to call it recognition. But Atlas noticed. The dog's head rose. His body went rigid for half a second before relaxing. Caleb didn't miss it. The man ordered coffee, never taking his eyes fully off them. Caleb felt the old instinct stirring in his spine, the awareness that danger sometimes arrived politely, with a smile. The man paid in cash and left without speaking. Through the window, Caleb watched him get into a black SUV parked across the street. The engine started. The vehicle didn't leave immediately. It idled, then slowly pulled away. Atlas remained still long after it was gone. Caleb looked down at him. You saw that too, huh? Atlas blinked once. Outside, the snow thickened slightly, softening the edges of the valley. Caleb finished his coffee and stood. The mountains loomed beyond town, dark and patient. Somewhere out there sat a farmhouse no one wanted, and for the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel invisible. He felt watched. He adjusted his grip on Atlas's leash and stepped back into the cold. The valley swallowed them in silence. He didn't know it yet, but the war he thought he left behind was waiting for him here, and this time, he wasn't facing it alone. The snow followed Caleb and Atlas down Main Street like a quiet escort. The town of Bitterroot felt smaller now that the bus had left. Storefronts sat low and weathered beneath the gray sky. A hardware store, a barber shop, a pharmacy with a faded American flag drooping in the cold. At the end of the block stood a brick building with gold lettering on frosted glass. Martha Green, attorney at law. Atlas paused before the steps, nose lifting slightly, testing the air. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's back. "Easy," he murmured. They climbed the narrow staircase. The wood creaked beneath Caleb's boots, each sound sharp in the stillness. He noticed the way his shoulders tightened automatically, the way his eyes scanned corners, door frames, blind spots. He'd been trained to clear buildings, not enter law offices. A small brass bell chimed as he opened the door. The office smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. Law books lined tall shelves against dark paneled walls. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, illuminating dust floating lazily in the air. Behind a wooden desk sat an elderly woman with silver hair pinned neatly back. Her posture was straight, her gaze sharp behind thin-framed glasses. "You must be Caleb Turner," she said before he could speak. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes flicked down to Atlas, taking in the disciplined stance, the quiet watchfulness. "He's welcome," she added before Caleb could ask. Atlas moved beside Caleb's chair, but remained standing, body angled slightly toward the door. Martha Green folded her hands on the desk. "I handled your uncle's affairs for nearly 15 years, she began. "He was a stubborn man." Caleb let out a quiet breath. "That's what I've heard." She slid a thick folder across the desk. "The property at 114 Turner Road, 42 acres, a farmhouse built in 1938, a barn added later. It has been in your family for 3 generations." Caleb absorbed that in silence. Martha continued, her tone measured. "However, there are complications." Atlas shifted slightly. Caleb felt it before he understood it. "What kind of complications?" Martha opened the folder. Inside were stamped documents, bank notices, and a bold red letter marked "Foreclosure Pending." "Your uncle took out a substantial loan against the property 6 years ago, a reverse mortgage. Additionally, property taxes have gone unpaid for nearly 2 years." Caleb stared at the numbers printed in black ink. The amount might as well have been written in another language. "So the farm's not really mine," he said flatly. "It is legally yours," Martha replied, "but it carries debt. Iron Ridge Development has expressed interest in purchasing the land to settle all outstanding liabilities." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in water. Atlas's ears lifted sharply. A low, almost imperceptible growl rumbled in his chest. Martha glanced down at him. "That company owns much of the logging land west of town," she added carefully. "Their CEO, Doyle Mercer, has made it clear they want your property." Caleb remembered the man from the diner, the tailored coat, the black SUV. "Why?" Caleb asked. "Location," Martha said. "Access to mineral rights, proximity to state forest land. They've been buying up surrounding parcels for years." She slid another document forward. "They are prepared to offer you $15,000 to sign over the deed immediately. They will assume the debt." 15,000. For a moment, Caleb pictured a small apartment somewhere south. A steady bed. A place without memories echoing in the walls. He hadn't slept through a full night in almost 2 years. He imagined Atlas stretched out on a rug instead of cold concrete. $15,000 could change that. Martha studied him quietly. "I'll be honest," she said. Most people in your position would take the offer. Most people, Caleb replied slowly, don't have people watching them in diners. Martha's expression tightened slightly. You've met Mr. Mercer. He made sure I saw him. Silence filled the office. Outside, a truck drove past, tires crunching over snow. Martha leaned back. The Turner property has a reputation in this valley, she said. People call it the house no one claims. After your uncle refused several purchase attempts, rumors began. They say it's cursed, that it brings trouble. Caleb almost smiled at that. I've had worse things follow me. Atlas shifted again, moving closer to Caleb's leg. Martha's voice softened. Your uncle insisted you be given a choice. He left very specific instructions that you see the property before signing anything. That caught Caleb's attention. He said that? Yes. He wrote it in his will. Martha opened a small envelope and withdrew a single iron key attached to a leather tag. Turner Road, front door. She set it on the desk between them. If you sign now, we can conclude this today. The funds will be wired within 48 hours. You could leave Bitterroot before the weekend. The simplicity of it pressed against Caleb's chest. Leave again. Keep moving. Never root. Never stay long enough for anything to collapse. Atlas nudged Caleb's hand. Caleb looked down at him. The dog's eyes were steady, unblinking. Caleb felt something shift, small but firm. I want to see it, he said. Martha nodded once as though she had expected that answer. It's 8 miles north of town, she said. Up an old logging road. I advise caution. The driveway hasn't been maintained. Caleb stood. Atlas moved with him in perfect synchronization. As Caleb reached for the key, his fingers brushed the cold metal. It felt heavier than it should have. Mr. Mercer will likely attempt to contact you again, Martha added. He prefers persuasion before paperwork. I've handled persuasion before, Caleb replied. Her eyes studied him, noticing the steady tone, the quiet discipline beneath the worn jacket. I believe you have. They stepped back into the cold. Snow had thickened slightly, softening rooftops and sidewalks. Atlas paused at the top of the stairs, scanning the street. Across the road, the black SUV was back, parked, engine running. Caleb felt it in his spine, the sensation of being measured, tested. The driver's window rolled down slightly. Doyle Mercer leaned across the seat, offering a thin smile. Mr. Turner, he called out smoothly. Welcome home. Caleb didn't answer. Mercer's gaze dropped briefly to Atlas. That's a fine dog, he said. Shame if he had to adjust to this weather. The words were light. Too light. Caleb felt the first spark of anger flicker beneath his ribs. Atlas stepped forward, body square, eyes locked. Mercer held Caleb's gaze another moment, then rolled up the window. The SUV pulled away slowly. Snow swirled in its wake. Caleb stood there, key clenched in his palm. $15,000 would solve a lot. But something about the way Mercer smiled made the decision feel less like an opportunity and more like surrender. Caleb clipped the leash firmly to Atlas's collar. Let's go see what they're so eager to buy. The mountains loomed beyond town, darker now beneath gathering clouds, and somewhere up that logging road waited a house no one claimed. Caleb adjusted the strap of his duffel and stepped off the last stretch of pavement onto a narrow shoulder where asphalt gave way to gravel. Atlas walked close at his side, shoulder brushing Caleb's thigh, the leash loose but ready. The road north of Bitterroot thinned quickly. Storefronts disappeared. Houses grew farther apart. Fences sagged beneath snow. The wind carried the sharp scent of pine and cold earth. 8 miles, Martha had said. Caleb had walked farther with less. The sky pressed low, heavy with coming weather. Tire tracks marked the first mile, then faded into untouched white as the gravel turned into an old logging road. Pine trees closed in on both sides, tall and silent, their branches bending under fresh snow. Atlas stopped once, ears snapping upright. Caleb paused too. Nothing moved, only wind whispering through the trees. "You hear it too?" Caleb asked quietly. Atlas's gaze remained fixed on the woods. Caleb listened. Silence. But not empty silence. The kind that hums. They moved again. The logging road narrowed, barely wet enough for a truck. Snow deepened around their boots. Caleb's breath clouded in front of him, steady at first. Then the wind shifted. A branch cracked somewhere deep in the tree line. Sharp. Sudden. Caleb's body reacted before his mind did. He pivoted, lowering his stance instinctively, scanning left, then right. His pulse spiked. The snow blurred for a second. The woods dissolved into a different landscape. Sand. Smoke. Gunfire echoing between stone walls. A radio screaming static. His chest tightened. His breath shortened. Atlas pressed hard into his leg. Solid. Real. Warm. Caleb blinked fast. The pines returned. Snow. Cold. Montana. He knelt, placing both hands on Atlas's shoulders. "I'm here," he said aloud, forcing the words steady. Atlas licked once at his wrist, then stepped forward, breaking the freeze. Caleb rose slowly. The road climbed gradually now, curving around a ridge. The wind grew stronger as they reached higher elevation. Through gaps in the trees, the valley opened below, white fields stretching toward town, rooftops barely visible in the distance. It was beautiful and isolating. The further they walked, the more the world behind them seemed to vanish. After nearly 2 hours, the logging road forked. A weathered wooden post leaned sideways at the split, half buried in snow. Faded paint read, "Turner Road." Caleb followed it. The path narrowed further, the trees growing denser. Branches scraped softly against his jacket as they passed. Atlas moved ahead now, nose low, scanning tracks in the snow. Then he stopped, completely still. Caleb followed his gaze. At the crest of a shallow hill, beyond the last line of trees, the farmhouse. It stood alone against the mountain backdrop. 2 stories. Faded white paint peeling away in strips. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, snow collecting unevenly along broken shingles. A wraparound porch tilted forward as though bowing beneath years of neglect. The barn stood 20 yards behind it, red paint long faded to rust brown. One side of the roof had partially collapsed inward. No smoke, no tire tracks in the driveway. No lights, just wind. Caleb felt something tighten inside him. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. This wasn't just abandoned. It was forgotten. Atlas moved first, stepping cautiously into the open field that had once been cleared land. Snow brushed against his legs. He scanned the house, then the barn, then the tree line behind them. Caleb followed slower. Every step felt heavier. The closer they got, the more details emerged. Windows boarded from the inside, one shutter hanging loose. The front door slightly crooked on its hinges. The porch stairs creaked when Caleb tested the first one with his boot. Atlas circled once beneath the porch, sniffing along the foundation. The wind carried a faint metallic scent. Caleb noticed it too. He climbed the remaining steps carefully. The iron key felt colder now in his palm. He stood before the door, studying it. Years of weather had worn the paint thin. Scratches lined the wood near the handle, not from age, from force. Atlas's low growl hummed again, barely audible. Caleb glanced at the doorframe. Fresh scuff marks along the edge. Someone had tried to enter. Recently. His heartbeat slowed, not with panic, but with focus. He stepped aside, positioning himself to the right of the door. "Stay," he whispered. Atlas froze in place. Caleb inserted the key. It resisted at first. He turned it slowly. The lock clicked. The sound echoed louder than it should have. He pushed the door open an inch. Cold air rushed out. Stale. Dust heavy. But beneath it, something else. Oil. Metal. Atlas pushed forward gently. Caleb opened the door fully. Darkness filled the entryway. He reached into his duffel and pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through floating dust motes. The living room revealed itself slowly. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets. A fireplace choked with ash. A rug half rolled near the stairs. But the dust on the floor told a different story. Footprints. Faint. Boot prints. Not his. Not recent enough to still be wet. But not old enough to be years. Atlas moved inside, paws silent against wood. He lowered his nose to the floor, tracing the path of the prints toward the back of the house. Caleb followed, every nerve sharpened. The kitchen door hung slightly open. Inside, cabinets stood ajar. One drawer lay on the floor. The back window was cracked. Not shattered. Opened. Atlas's posture shifted again. Ears forward, tail rigid. Caleb stepped toward the window. Outside, the snow near the foundation was disturbed. Tire marks, half covered by fresh snowfall. Someone had been here within the last day. He stepped back slowly. This wasn't just an abandoned inheritance. This was active, alive. Atlas suddenly moved toward the hallway, nose lifted, then turned sharply toward the barn door, visible through the kitchen's side entrance. His body stiffened. Caleb followed his line of sight. The barn door swayed slightly in the wind. Or had it moved? He couldn't tell. Atlas took one step toward it, then another. Caleb exhaled slowly. "We check it together." They stepped back outside. The cold hit harder now that adrenaline ran warm in his veins. The snow around the barn showed more disturbance, deeper impressions. Something heavy had been moved recently. Atlas circled the barn's side, then stopped abruptly at the rear wall. He began sniffing intensely at a section of wood planking near ground level. Not random, focused. He pawed once, then twice. Caleb approached carefully. The wood paneling looked slightly different there. Newer nails. Different grain. He crouched, brushing snow away from the base. The ground beneath was packed tighter than the rest. Atlas whined softly. Not fear. Alert. Caleb stood slowly. He scanned the tree line again. The valley below was distant now, nearly hidden behind snowfall. They were alone. Or at least, they appeared to be. Caleb's jaw tightened. Whatever this house was, it wasn't empty, and it didn't want to be ignored. The wind rose again, stronger now, rattling loose metal against the barn roof. Atlas remained fixed on that section of wall. Caleb rested his hand on the dog's back. "Tomorrow," he murmured. "We dig tomorrow." Snow began falling heavier, flakes thick and steady. The farmhouse stood silent behind them, watching. Snow gathered along the porch railing as dusk pressed in. The light had drained from the valley, leaving only a gray-blue glow that made the house seem older than it was. Caleb stood in the yard with Atlas beside him, eyes tracing the lines of the roof, the sagging gutters, the broken boards. He had been in abandoned compounds overseas. He knew the difference between a place that had been forgotten and one that had been disturbed. This was disturbed. "Inside," he said quietly. Atlas followed him back up the porch steps. The boards groaned under their weight, the sound sharp in the still air. Caleb shut the front door firmly behind them, cutting off the wind. Darkness settled instantly. He clicked on the flashlight again. The beam slid slowly across the living room. Dust blanketed the furniture. The sheets covering the couch were brittle with age. But near the fireplace, the dust had been disturbed. A narrow path swept clear across the floorboards. Boot prints. Atlas moved ahead, nose close to the ground, tracking the scent. His body remained tight, alert. He followed the path toward the hallway. Caleb's pulse steadied, not because he felt safe, but because clarity had replaced doubt. Someone had searched this house. The hallway walls were lined with old photographs. Caleb paused at one. His uncle, younger, standing beside a truck. Another showed the farmhouse decades earlier, freshly painted, porch straight and strong. He swallowed and moved on. In the first bedroom, drawers had been pulled out and emptied onto the floor, papers scattered, a mattress overturned. Someone had gone through everything. Atlas sniffed the corners carefully, then moved toward the second room. The air inside felt different there, colder. The floorboards creaked louder beneath Caleb's boots. He swept the flashlight slowly across the room. Empty bed frame. Closet door open. The closet floor showed scratch marks along one section of wood. Atlas stopped at the threshold and stared. Then he stepped inside. He lowered his head, inhaling deeply near the base of the back wall. His tail stiffened. Caleb crouched beside him. "What is it?" Atlas pawed once at the wood. Caleb examined the paneling. The boards were old pine, except for one vertical strip near the corner. That piece looked newer. The nails shone slightly under the beam of light. Different grain, different color. He ran his fingers along the edge. Loose. Before he could pry it, a sudden sound froze both of them. Headlights. Caleb rose instantly, moving to the window. Through a crack in the boarded slats, he saw beams of white light sweep across the yard. Not random. Deliberate. A vehicle had stopped near the driveway. Atlas let out a low, warning growl. Caleb turned off the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness. He guided Atlas silently into the hallway and back toward the living room, positioning himself beside the front window where he could see without being seen. The headlights remained steady for a long moment. Then the engine revved. Snow crunched under tires. The vehicle turned and drove back down the logging road. Caleb didn't move until the sound faded completely. He counted in his head. 10 seconds. 20. 1 full minute. Atlas remained rigid, ears angled toward the door. Caleb exhaled slowly. "They're not subtle," he muttered. He turned the flashlight back on and walked toward the kitchen. The cracked window there told its own story. The latch had been forced from the outside. Muddy snow marked the sill. He stepped closer. On the counter lay a folded paper that hadn't been there before. Clean, uncreased, placed deliberately. Caleb picked it up. 3 words written in black ink. Sign the deed. No name, no signature. Just the message. Atlas stepped closer, sniffing the paper, then turning his head toward the door again. Caleb folded the note slowly and slid it into his jacket pocket. The unease he'd felt earlier hardened into something colder. Calculated. Whoever wanted this land didn't want him comfortable. They wanted him unsettled. He walked back to the living room and set his duffel down near the fireplace. Snow tapped softly against the windows. The wind howled once, then faded. Atlas moved toward the barn door again, visible through the side window. His focus returned to that same spot behind the barn wall. Caleb remembered the disturbed snow, the packed earth. Whatever was hidden there had drawn someone else, too. He grabbed an old iron poker from beside the fireplace and returned to the bedroom closet where Atlas had pawed at the boards. He wedged the poker gently between the newer panel and the frame. Wood groaned. He paused, listening. Nothing. He applied pressure. The board loosened slightly, but didn't give fully. He stepped back. Tomorrow, he repeated softly. Night had fallen completely now. The house creaked under the cold. Every settling board sounded amplified in the quiet. Caleb unrolled his sleeping bag on the living room floor, keeping his back against the wall and his line of sight toward both the hallway and the front door. Atlas positioned himself between Caleb and the entryway. The dog lay down, but didn't close his eyes. Caleb stared at the ceiling beams. The image of the headlights replayed behind his eyes. The note, the scuffed door, the closet panel. He realized something important in that stillness. They weren't just trying to buy the land. They were trying to erase something. And they believed it was still here. Wind rattled the barn roof outside. Atlas lifted his head once more, listening. Caleb rested his hand on the dog's shoulder. You hear them too, don't you? Atlas didn't move, but he didn't relax either. The farmhouse no one claimed had just made it clear. They were not alone. Caleb didn't sleep much that night. The wind pressed against the old siding, like a steady hand testing weak boards. Snow ticked softly against the windows. The house creaked in long, tired sighs. Atlas stayed positioned between Caleb and the front door, head lifted every few minutes, ears shifting toward faint sounds outside. Sometime after midnight, the wind died. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Caleb's eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. He had learned long ago how to hover between rest and readiness. His breathing was slow, controlled. Atlas's posture changed first. His head rose fully. Muscles tightened beneath his coat. Then came the sound. Not wind, not wood settling. A footstep, soft, crunching snow. Caleb's eyes opened instantly. He didn't move. He listened. Another step. Closer this time. Circling the house. Atlas let out a low, steady growl, not loud enough to echo, but deep enough to warn. Caleb rolled silently onto one knee, reaching for the flashlight, but not turning it on. He moved toward the kitchen window where the cracked pane faced the barn. A shadow moved past the glass. Quick, deliberate. Caleb felt the old surge in his veins. Not panic, not fear. Focus. He motioned to Atlas with 2 fingers. The dog moved to his side without sound. The back door handle rattled once, then harder. Metal scraping against wood. Someone was testing it. Caleb stepped to the side of the doorway, positioning himself out of sight. The handle twisted again. A whispered voice floated faintly through the wood. Check the barn. A second voice answered, lower, impatient. Make it quick. Atlas's body trembled, not from fear, but restraint. Caleb waited. Footsteps retreated from the back door. Then came the barn door's long, complaining creak. They were inside. Caleb exhaled slowly. Now, he whispered. He opened the back door just enough for Atlas to slip through first. The dog moved like a shadow across the snow, silent and fast. Caleb followed close behind, boots steady despite the icy ground. The barn loomed ahead, one side half collapsed, the other dark and open. A faint beam of light flickered inside. Flashlight. Caleb moved along the outer wall, staying low. Atlas paused at the barn entrance, waiting for the signal. Inside, the men's voices carried clearer now. Boss said it's here somewhere. Old man must have hidden it good. Just tear the boards out. A loud crack echoed as someone pried at wood. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't random intimidation. They were searching for something specific. Atlas glanced back at him once. Caleb nodded. The dog burst inside first. A sudden bark exploded through the barn. Deep, commanding, trained. One of the men shouted, "Dog!" A beam of light jerked wildly as Atlas lunged. Caleb entered seconds later. Two men stood near the back wall, the same section Atlas had fixated on earlier. One held a crowbar. The other dropped his flashlight in surprise. Atlas collided with the man holding the crowbar, knocking him backward into a stack of old crates. The metal bar clattered to the floor. The second man stumbled toward the side exit, slipping on loose hay. Caleb stepped between them, voice firm and controlled. "Drop it. Now!" The man on the ground froze as Atlas stood over him, teeth bared but not biting. The second man bolted for the open side door. Atlas turned instantly to pursue. "Atlas, hold!" The command cut through the barn. Atlas stopped mid-stride, body rigid, eyes locked on the fleeing figure. The man vanished into the trees. Snow swallowed the sound of his retreat. Caleb stepped back toward the first intruder. The man's breath came fast and sharp. "You don't want trouble," the man muttered. "You're in the wrong place, Bo," Caleb replied calmly. Atlas growled again, stepping closer. The man raised his hands slowly. "We were just checking the structure, making sure it wasn't a hazard." "In the middle of the night?" Caleb asked evenly. Silence answered. The man glanced toward the forest. "They're gonna take this place, Pinsel," he said quietly. "You're just delaying it." Caleb stepped forward one pace. "Who's they?" The man's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. From the tree line, an engine roared to life. Headlights flickered briefly between branches. The man on the ground twisted suddenly, shoving sideways. Atlas lunged, but the man rolled free, scrambling toward the barn opening. Caleb moved to block him, but the snow outside gave way beneath their boots. The man stumbled forward and ran for the waiting vehicle. Atlas pursued, but as he leapt over a broken section of fence, his paw caught on rusted barbed wire. A sharp yelp cut through the night. Caleb's heart dropped. "Atlas!" The SUV's tires spun, spraying snow, and vanished down the logging road. Caleb reached Atlas in 2 strides. The dog stood tangled in wire, one foreleg caught and bleeding. "Easy, easy," Caleb murmured, kneeling in the snow. Atlas remained still, trusting. Caleb carefully untangled the wire and inspected the cut. It wasn't deep, but it bled steadily. He pressed his sleeve against it to stop the flow. "You're okay," he said softly. Atlas's breathing slowed under his touch. The barn stood open behind them, one section of wall partially torn loose where the men had pried at it. They hadn't found what they were looking for. Not yet. Caleb helped Atlas back toward the house, supporting his weight gently, despite the dog's stubborn attempt to walk normally. Inside, Caleb cleaned the cut with bottled water from his duffel and wrapped the paw carefully. Atlas watched him the entire time, eyes steady. "Should have called you back sooner," Caleb muttered quietly. Atlas rested his chin on Caleb's knee. The anger came slowly. Not wild, not reckless, controlled. Whoever sent those men believed this farm held something worth risking jail for, something worth threatening a veteran and cutting a dog over. Caleb stood and walked to the window again. The logging road lay empty now, snowfall already covering tire tracks. The note in his pocket felt heavier than before. "Sign the deed." He pulled it out and looked at the words under the dim flashlight beam. They weren't offering $15,000. They were trying to silence something. Caleb folded the note again and slipped it back into his jacket. Atlas shifted his weight, testing his bandaged paw. "You still want to dig tomorrow?" Caleb asked. Atlas lifted his head, ears forward. No hesitation. Caleb allowed himself the smallest smile. "Yeah, me too." The farmhouse creaked around them, but it no longer felt abandoned. It felt guarded. And whatever lay hidden behind that barn wall had just become worth fighting for. Dawn came pale and brittle over Bitterroot Valley. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world hushed beneath a clean sheet of snow. The mountains stood sharp against a sky washed in cold blue. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb was already awake. He had barely slept. Not from fear, but from calculation. Atlas lay near the fireplace, his bandaged paw stretched forward. The dog's eyes were open, tracking Caleb's movements as he tightened the laces on his boots. "You're supposed to rest," Caleb muttered quietly. Atlas thumped his tail once against the floor. "Stubborn." Caleb stepped outside and inhaled the mountain air. It burned clean in his lungs. The tire tracks from the SUV had been swallowed by fresh snowfall. The world looked untouched. But he knew better. He crossed the yard toward the barn, shovel and pry bar in hand. Atlas limped behind him, refusing to stay back despite Caleb's earlier command. The barn door hung crooked from last night's break-in. Caleb pushed it open slowly. Sunlight cut through the gaps in the siding, illuminating floating dust and the disturbed section of wall at the rear. The boards the intruders had tried to pry were cracked now, splintered along the edges. Atlas moved directly toward that same spot, nose low, posture focused. He didn't hesitate. He pawed at the base again, ignoring the protest of his injured leg. "Easy," Caleb said, kneeling beside him. He pressed the shovel into the packed earth at the base of the wall. The soil beneath the snow was dense, more compact than the surrounding ground, not natural. Caleb drove the shovel down harder. Metal struck something solid beneath the dirt. The sound rang sharp. Atlas froze, then barked once, short and sharp. Caleb brushed snow and soil aside with gloved hands. A corner of metal appeared beneath the surface. A box, army green, old. He dug faster now, exposing the entire lid. The metal container was heavy, rust lining its hinges. He lifted it slowly. It wasn't buried deep, just concealed. Caleb carried the box into the center of the barn and set it down. Atlas sat beside it, eyes locked. Caleb wiped dirt from the latch and flipped it open. Inside lay stacks of documents, bound carefully in waterproof sleeves. A small leather notebook rested on top. He picked up the notebook first. The handwriting was firm and steady. Elias Turner, his uncle. Caleb swallowed. He began to read. Entries dated back 5 years. Descriptions of unfamiliar trucks arriving late at night. Strange drilling activity beyond the ridge. Men in corporate jackets measuring soil samples near the western property line. And one name repeated over and over. Iron Ridge. Caleb's jaw tightened. He turned the page. There were maps, hand-drawn diagrams marking portions of the land. Notes circled certain areas near the tree line. Mineral survey attempts. Unauthorized. Caleb's pulse slowed into that controlled rhythm he remembered from mission briefings. This wasn't paranoia. This was documentation. He opened one of the sealed envelopes from the box. Inside were photocopies of land records, mineral rights filings, and survey permits filed by Iron Ridge. Permits that did not include the Turner property. They had been testing around it, but not officially on it. Atlas shifted closer as Caleb continued reading. One entry stood out. Mercer knows there's lithium beneath the ridge. He can't extract it without the Turner parcel. He's offering pennies now, but he won't stop. Caleb stared at the words. Lithium, energy storage, battery minerals, worth millions if verified. He flipped through more pages. His uncle had hired an independent geologist 2 years ago. The report was attached inside the box. Confirmed deposit beneath the Turner acreage. Significant. Strategic. Caleb leaned back slowly against a wooden beam. $15,000. They hadn't been offering charity. They had been trying to secure access. Atlas nudged his arm. "Yeah," Caleb whispered. "I see it now." He opened another sealed packet. This one held photographs. Grainy images taken from a distance. Iron Ridge vehicles parked along the western boundary. Men drilling shallow cores at dusk. Equipment hidden beneath tarps. There was also a copy of a cease and desist letter his uncle had sent to Iron Ridge 2 years ago. They had ignored it. Caleb felt something shift inside him again. Not anger this time. Clarity. The barn wasn't just being searched for money. It was being searched for proof. He closed the notebook and sat still for a long moment. The cold no longer felt sharp. It felt steady. Atlas rested his head briefly against Caleb's shoulder. "You knew before I did," Caleb murmured. Atlas blinked slowly. Caleb gathered the documents carefully and slid them back into the metal box, but something else caught his attention. The bottom of the container held another smaller envelope, unmarked. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, addressed to him. "Caleb, if you're reading this, it means they've already started circling you." He inhaled slowly and continued. "I didn't leave you debt. I left you leverage. They want this land for what sits beneath it. They will pressure you. They will threaten you. But the proof is here. Don't trust them, and don't assume the town is neutral." Caleb's chest tightened. Don't assume the town is neutral. He thought of Deputy Briggs brushing off his concerns. He thought of Mercer's smile. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his jacket. Atlas suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the barn entrance. Caleb followed his gaze. A figure stood just beyond the doorway. Deputy Nolan Briggs, hands resting on his belt, watching. "Morning," Briggs called casually. Caleb rose slowly, stepping in front of the metal box. "Morning." Briggs glanced around the barn, taking in the broken boards and disturbed earth. "Looks like you had visitors," he said. "You know anything about that?" Caleb asked. Briggs shrugged lightly. "Logging roads bring curious folks." His eyes drifted toward the ground near the freshly dug soil, then back to Caleb. "You planning to stay out here long?" Briggs asked. "That depends," Caleb replied evenly. "On what?" "On whether people leave me alone." A long silence stretched between them. Briggs shifted his weight. "This valley doesn't like conflict," he said finally. "Folks here prefer things settled quiet." Caleb held his gaze. "Some things aren't meant to be quiet." Briggs studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "Well, stay safe." He turned and walked back toward his patrol truck parked near the tree line. Atlas watched until the vehicle disappeared. Caleb remained standing in the barn, sunlight catching the edges of the metal box at his feet. The inheritance wasn't a broken farmhouse. It was leverage. And whoever had tried to buy it cheap wasn't finished yet. The metal box felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried. Caleb sealed it again and carried it into the farmhouse, setting it down on the kitchen table beneath the cracked window. Atlas followed closely, favoring his bandaged paw but refusing to slow. The morning light stretched long across the wooden floorboards, revealing every scratch and imperfection. Dust shimmered in the air like faint smoke. Caleb opened the leather notebook again. He read more carefully this time. Dates. Times. Names. Elias Turner had been meticulous. Each entry documented a pattern. Iron Ridge vehicles arriving at odd hours. Soil samples taken without permission. Letters sent to the county office that went unanswered. Then the tone shifted. One entry was darker. The handwriting slightly heavier. "They approached me again. Said it would be easier for everyone if I sold. Said I was stubborn. Said my brother learned that the hard way." Caleb froze. His brother. Caleb's father. He turned the page. He thought he could expose them 10 years ago. He gathered evidence about illegal waste dumping near the Western Creek. 3 weeks later, the equipment malfunctioned. Official report called it operator error, but the brake lines don't sever themselves. Caleb's breath thinned. He hadn't been home when his father died. He'd been in training, first deployment cycle. The news had come in a clipped phone call from his mother. Accident. Heavy equipment rollover. Unavoidable. He had accepted that explanation because it was easier than digging deeper. His fingers tightened around the page. Atlas noticed. The dog rose slowly and placed his chin on Caleb's thigh, grounding. Caleb swallowed and continued reading. I kept quiet after that, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want Caleb drawn into it. He joined the service. Better he fight overseas than inherit this mess. Caleb shut his eyes. The old ache stirred. He had believed his father's death was random, a tragedy in a long line of tragedies. But now, it had edges, shape, intent. The air in the kitchen felt thinner. A sudden bang echoed outside, just a loose shutter slamming in the wind, but Caleb flinched instinctively. For a second, he wasn't in Montana. He was back in a narrow alley overseas, pinned between concrete walls, the smell of dust, the echo of distant gunfire. His heart pounded hard enough to blur his vision. Atlas moved immediately, pressing his weight against Caleb's knees, forcing him back into the present. Easy, Caleb whispered to himself. He focused on Atlas's breathing. Steady, slow. He counted silently. 5 breaths. 10. The farmhouse came back into view. Snow against the window. Mountain light. Silence. He exhaled long. The war followed me home, he said quietly. Atlas's ears twitched. Caleb returned to the notebook. Another entry. Deputy Briggs avoids eye contact now. I don't blame him. Small towns don't like choosing sides. But silence is a choice. Caleb stared at that line. Silence is a choice. He remembered Briggs standing outside the barn that morning, eyes lingering too long on the disturbed soil. The deputy wasn't ignorant. He was conflicted. Caleb flipped to the final pages. The last entry was written only weeks before Elias had died. They will escalate when I'm gone. They think Caleb will sell fast. They don't know him. He has his father's spine. If he reads this, he must decide whether to fight or walk away. I hope he chooses to fight, but I'll understand if he doesn't. Caleb closed the notebook gently. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling beams. For years he had carried guilt for not being home when his father died, for not protecting his family. Now the guilt twisted into something sharper. Purpose. Atlas stepped away from him and walked slowly toward the hallway. He paused near the floorboards by the living room's outer wall. Then he began sniffing again. Focused. Persistent. Caleb rose. You're not done, are you? Atlas pawed at a loose board near the base of the wall. Not the barn. The house. Caleb crouched beside him. The board shifted slightly under pressure. He pried it upward with the iron poker. Dust rose in a faint cloud. Beneath the board lay a narrow cavity. Inside were sealed plastic bags. And something else. A metal binder. He lifted it carefully. Inside the binder were printed emails, Iron Ridge internal correspondence, names, dates, mentions of mineral rights acquisition strategies, references to removing obstacles. One message stood out. If Turner refuses, pressure county valuation, increase tax assessment, he'll fold. Another. Keep the testing discreet. No official filings until parcel secured. Caleb felt a slow, rising heat in his chest. They hadn't just been circling. They had engineered the debt, increased the tax pressure, waited for foreclosure. Atlas gave a soft whine. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's head. They weren't just buying land, he said quietly. They were squeezing it. The full picture settled into place. Lithium beneath the ridge, illegal testing, potential waste dumping, tax manipulation, his father's accident, his uncle's isolation, all converging here. The farmhouse wasn't cursed. It had been targeted. Caleb stood slowly. Outside, clouds began gathering again over the mountains. Shadows stretched longer across the snow. He walked to the window and looked toward the tree line. Somewhere beyond those trees sat Iron Ridge's main operation yard. He imagined Mercer behind a polished desk, believing the problem was temporary, believing a homeless veteran would take the money and disappear. Caleb's jaw tightened. Atlas stepped beside him, staring out into the valley as if sensing the shift. For the first time since stepping off that bus, Caleb felt something stronger than survival. He felt responsibility. But responsibility came with weight, and the weight pressed heavy against his ribs. He thought of the shelters, the cold concrete floors, the nights when the noise in his head had been louder than the streets. He could walk away, sell the land, take the money, forget the past. But the notebook on the table wouldn't disappear. His father's name wouldn't disappear. Atlas's paw throbbed faintly as the dog shifted weight. Caleb looked down at him. "You didn't drag me out of that barn last night for nothing, did you?" Atlas met his gaze without blinking. Outside, far down the logging road, a distant engine sound rolled faintly through the trees. Not close, but present. Caleb closed the binder slowly. "They think I'll fold," he said under his breath. The mountains stood silent, unmoved, and beneath the snow-covered ridge, something valuable waited, but so did something darker. The truth had been buried. Now it was rising. The afternoon sky darkened early, heavy clouds rolling low over the Bitterroot peaks. Snow no longer fell, but the air carried the weight of another storm waiting its turn. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb stood still for a long moment, listening to the quiet. Atlas moved again before Caleb did. The dog left the window and padded slowly toward the center of the living room, favoring his bandaged paw but ignoring it. He stopped near the outer wall facing the western ridge, the same direction marked repeatedly in Elias Turner's notebook. Then Atlas lowered his head. He sniffed once, twice. His posture changed. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was detection. Caleb stepped closer. "What is it?" Atlas pawed at the floorboard near the edge of the room. The wood creaked under pressure. Caleb crouched and ran his hand along the seam. One plank shifted slightly beneath his fingers, barely noticeable unless someone was looking for it. He reached for the iron poker again and wedged it into the crack. The board resisted. He applied steady pressure. It lifted with a splintering groan. Cold air rose from beneath the floor. Not the normal chill of a crawl space. Something else. A faint chemical sharpness. Atlas stepped forward immediately, nose lowering toward the opening. He sniffed deeply, then let out a short, tense exhale. Caleb shone the flashlight into the darkness below. At first, all he saw were beams and dirt, then metal, round edges, barrels. Not one, several. Sealed industrial containers stacked beneath the house. Caleb's stomach tightened. He widened the opening by removing another plank. The smell grew stronger, acrid, artificial. Atlas shifted closer, ignoring Caleb's hand trying to hold him back. The dog leaned forward and began pawing at the dirt around the nearest barrel. "Atlas, easy," Caleb warned. But the dog persisted. He scraped at the soil until the loose earth gave way enough for Caleb to see the faded lettering stamped on the metal surface. Iron Ridge, property of IRD Materials. Caleb stared at it. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't mineral rights or survey manipulation. This was concealment. He climbed down carefully into the crawl space, keeping the flashlight steady. Atlas whined softly above him, but stayed at the opening. Caleb approached the nearest barrel and examined its lid. The seal appeared intact, but rust traced faint lines along the rim. He moved to the next barrel. Same marking, same seal. 6 of them in total, hidden beneath his uncle's home. The notebook entries flashed through his mind, Illegal dumping near the Western Creek. Pressure tactics. Silence. They hadn't just wanted lithium. They had needed access. If this land changed hands quietly, the evidence would disappear under legal ownership. Caleb climbed back up through the floor opening. Atlas immediately pressed against him, nose touching Caleb's chest as if confirming he was intact. "I know," Caleb whispered. He knelt and inspected Atlas's paw. The bandage had shifted slightly during the digging. A thin line of red seeped through the cloth. "You never listen," Caleb said gently. Atlas's ears flicked. Caleb rewrapped the bandage carefully, tightening it just enough to hold without restricting movement. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, rattling the loose boards of the porch. A sharp knock struck the front door. 3 heavy thuds. Caleb froze. Atlas's head snapped toward the sound, body rigid. Another knock. "Turner!" a voice called out from the other side. "County inspection!" Caleb rose slowly and walked to the window. He peeled back a sliver of board to look out. 2 trucks sat in the yard. County decals on the doors. Behind them, parked farther back near the tree line, the black SUV. Mercer didn't even bother hiding anymore. Atlas growled low. Caleb inhaled once and opened the front door. 2 men in county jackets stood on the porch. One carried a clipboard. The other avoided eye contact. "Mr. Turner," the clipboard man said stiffly, "we received reports of structural instability. We need to conduct a safety inspection." "At sunset?" Caleb asked calmly. The man cleared his throat. "Complaint was filed this afternoon." "By who?" The man didn't answer. Caleb stepped aside slightly, but did not move fully out of the doorway. "You can inspect from the porch," he said evenly. "No one's entering the property without a warrant." The second man shifted uncomfortably. From the driveway, the SUV door opened. Doyle Mercer stepped out, coat collar raised against the wind. He approached slowly, boots crunching on snow. "Caleb," Mercer said smoothly, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." Caleb met his gaze without flinching. "You're trespassing." Mercer smiled faintly. "We're ensuring public safety." "You're covering tracks." The smile faded slightly. The county inspectors exchanged uncertain glances. Mercer stepped closer to the porch, but stopped short of the final step. "You don't understand what you're sitting on," Mercer said quietly. "I understand enough." Mercer's eyes flicked briefly toward the house floor, then back to Caleb. "For your sake," Mercer continued, voice lowering, "I hope you haven't dug too deep." Atlas stepped forward beside Caleb, body square, silent, but unmistakably protective. The wind howled across the yard. The mountains loomed behind Mercer like silent witnesses. Caleb felt no hesitation now. "They buried something under my house," he said plainly. "That's not a safety concern. That's a federal one." The inspectors stiffened. Mercer's expression changed. Not anger, not panic. Calculation. "You're tired," Mercer said. "You've had a long few years. Maybe you're seeing problems that aren't there." Caleb took one slow step down from the porch. His voice remained steady. "You made a mistake." Mercer tilted his head slightly. "And what's that?" "You assumed I'd sell." Silence fell heavy between them. Atlas's injured paw trembled faintly, but he did not retreat. Mercer studied the dog briefly. "Dogs don't understand property law," he said lightly. "No," Caleb replied. "They understand loyalty." The wind carried that word across the yard. Mercer glanced back toward the inspectors. "File your report," he said curtly. The men scribbled quickly and retreated toward their truck. Mercer lingered one final moment. "This valley doesn't forgive stubborn men," he said. Caleb held his gaze. "Neither do I." Mercer turned and walked back to the SUV. Engines roared. Tires spun. The vehicles disappeared down the logging road once more. Caleb stood still until the sound faded. Atlas exhaled sharply beside him. Caleb looked down at the dog. "You smell it too, don't you?" he murmured. Atlas's ears remained forward. Under the floorboards lay sealed proof. Under the mountain lay lithium. And above ground, a corporation willing to intimidate, manipulate, and bury. Caleb closed the front door slowly. Inside the farmhouse, the lifted floorboards gaped like an open wound. The farm wasn't cursed. It was contaminated. And now, they both knew it. The farmhouse felt different after Mercer left. Not weaker, exposed. Caleb replaced the floorboards carefully, sealing the crawl space again for now. He moved with steady precision, each plank set back into place as if nothing had been disturbed. But the knowledge remained. 6 sealed barrels beneath his home. Evidence of illegal dumping. Proof of corporate manipulation. Atlas watched him the entire time. Posture alert. Ears flicking toward every sound outside. By late afternoon, clouds thickened until the mountains disappeared behind a gray curtain. Snow began again, slow and heavy. Caleb secured the barn door as best he could and stacked loose lumber against it. He checked the perimeter of the property twice, boots crunching through fresh snowfall. No vehicles, no figures in the tree line. Too quiet. Inside, he built a small fire in the fireplace, not for warmth alone, but for light. The flicker steadied the room. Atlas lay near the hearth, exhausted, but unwilling to fully rest. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with Elias's notebook open again. He made copies of key documents using his phone camera, storing them in multiple secure folders. He wrote down license plate numbers he had memorized from the trucks. He worked methodically, controlled. Night fell fully before he noticed. The valley disappeared into darkness once more. Around 9 o'clock, the wind shifted. It didn't howl this time. It stilled. Atlas's head lifted. The dog didn't growl. He didn't bark. He went rigid. Caleb felt it immediately. He stood and moved toward the front window, killing the interior lights. The property lay black beneath the falling snow. Then, headlights burst through the darkness at full speed, not stopping at the driveway, not slowing. A truck roared up the logging road straight toward the house. Caleb's pulse snapped into rhythm. "Back!" he commanded. Atlas moved beside him instantly. The truck skidded sideways in the snow and stopped near the barn. Doors flew open. 2 figures jumped out. One carried something in his hand. Glass bottle. Rag stuffed in the neck. Fire flared at the tip. Molotov. Caleb's breath shortened for half a second, but only half. "Move!" he barked. The bottle arced through the air. It shattered against the barn wall. Flames erupted instantly, licking across dry wood. Atlas lunged forward instinctively, but Caleb grabbed his harness. "Stay!" The second bottle flew. This one struck closer to the barn entrance. Fire spread rapidly along the old timber. Smoke thickened fast in the cold air. The men retreated toward the truck. Atlas tore free of Caleb's grip and sprinted forward, not toward the flames, but toward the fleeing figures. "Atlas!" Caleb shouted. The dog closed distance with explosive speed. One of the men stumbled backward in the snow, dropping a metal object that clattered across the ground. The truck engine revved hard. The driver panicked and accelerated too soon. The tires spun uselessly against the icy road. Atlas reached the rear of the vehicle and barked violently, circling. The passenger scrambled inside. The truck finally gained traction and tore down the logging road, fishtailing as it vanished. Atlas stood in the snow, chest heaving. Flames roared behind him. Caleb grabbed a shovel and sprinted to the barn. He tore loose snow from the ground and hurled it onto the base of the fire. He moved with trained efficiency, targeting the source, not the flare. Atlas returned immediately, despite the heat. He positioned himself between Caleb and the burning structure. A section of timber collapsed inward with a crack. Heat surged outward. Atlas lunged suddenly, not at the fire, but at Caleb. The dog slammed into his legs just as another flaming beam dropped from above. The beam struck the ground where Caleb had been standing seconds earlier. Caleb stumbled backward into the snow. Atlas stood in front of him, ears back, body braced. The fire burned hard, but Caleb had gained control of the lower sections. The snow dampened the spread. Within minutes, the blaze shrank to smoking embers. The barn wall was blackened and scarred, but standing. Caleb's breathing slowed gradually. He looked down. Atlas's fur along his shoulder was singed. A small patch of skin reddened beneath it. "Hold still," Caleb whispered. He examined the burn carefully. Minor. Painful, but not deep. Atlas didn't whine. He held eye contact instead. "You pulled me out," Caleb said quietly. The dog blinked once. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Someone from town must have seen the glow. Deputy Briggs's patrol truck arrived first, lights flashing across the snow. He stepped out slowly, eyes scanning the barn. "Jesus," Briggs muttered. "Arson," Caleb said plainly. Briggs studied the charred wood. "You see who did it?" "I saw enough." Briggs hesitated. "Turner, this is escalating." It already escalated. Fire trucks arrived shortly after. Volunteers extinguished the remaining embers fully. Mercer did not appear, but Caleb knew. This hadn't been reckless intimidation. It had been a message. Atlas stood close to Caleb the entire time, leaning subtly against his leg despite the sting of his burn. When the trucks left and the night settled again, the farmhouse felt smaller. The sky above was black and empty. Caleb knelt beside Atlas inside the living room. He applied a cooling compress gently over the singed fur. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said. Atlas's tail tapped softly once. Outside, smoke rose faintly from the damaged barn. Caleb rose and walked to the window once more. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was steady. "They're scared," he murmured. Atlas's ears flicked. They wouldn't burn it unless they were scared. The fire had failed. The evidence remained. The farmhouse still stood. And now, the enemy had shown its face. Morning broke cold and colorless over Bitterroot Valley. Smoke from the scorched barn still curled faintly into the air, a black scar against white snow. Caleb stood outside with a thermos in one hand, staring at the damage. The fire hadn't taken the structure, but it had marked it. Marked him. Atlas stood beside him, shoulder singed, paw bandaged, eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting another vehicle to emerge. "They escalated," Caleb said quietly. "So we escalate smarter." He turned and walked back inside. The farmhouse no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a forward operating base. He spread the documents across the kitchen table again. Elias's notebook, the mineral survey, the internal emails, photographs of drilling equipment, the barrel markings beneath the floorboards. He organized them into categories: illegal mineral testing, coercive land acquisition, environmental contamination, potential corporate fraud. He photographed everything again from multiple angles, uploading copies to encrypted storage and sending backup files to a secure cloud account he had set up years ago during a private contracting job. Atlas lay near the doorway, watching every move. "You're part of this," Caleb said. "You found it." The dog's ears lifted. By mid-morning, Caleb drove into town for the first time since the fire. He parked near Grace Holloway's diner. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Conversations slowed. A few locals stared openly at the burn mark on his sleeve and the faint singe on Atlas's coat. Grace stepped out from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "You look like you wrestled the mountain," she said softly. "Close," Caleb replied. She studied him a moment longer, then nodded toward a booth in the back. "Coffee's on the house." He slid into the booth, Atlas settling at his feet. Grace poured coffee and leaned closer. Word travels fast here, she said quietly. They say your barn caught fire. Didn't catch, Caleb answered. Was helped. Grace's jaw tightened. Iron Ridge has been pushing hard these last few years, she said. Bought up 3 properties along the ridge. Folks who refused, well, strange things happened. Like what? Caleb asked. She hesitated. Inspections, fines, insurance issues, pressure. Caleb nodded slowly. I need a journalist, he said. Grace blinked. You're not thinking small. I don't have that luxury. She studied his face carefully. You sure you want to go public? Caleb looked down at Atlas. The dog's injured paw rested steady on the floor. They set my barn on fire, Caleb said evenly. That's public already. Grace stepped back and disappeared into the kitchen. She returned with a folded card. Name's Daniel Brooks, she said. Used to cover environmental investigations in Helena. Semi-retired. Doesn't scare easy. Caleb took the card. Thank you. Grace placed her hand lightly on the table. Be careful, she said. Mercer doesn't lose. Caleb met her gaze. Everyone loses eventually. Outside the diner, a black SUV idled across the street. Mercer didn't get out this time. He didn't need to. Caleb felt the eyes from behind tinted glass. He walked Atlas back to the truck without looking over. At the edge of town, Caleb stopped at the frozen river bridge. He stepped out, boots crunching on ice-crusted gravel. The Bitterroot River lay half-frozen beneath the steel frame of the bridge, dark water pushing steadily beneath a crust of white. Atlas stood beside him, watching the current. Caleb dialed the number on Grace's card. Daniel Brooks, a gravelly voice answered. My name is Caleb Turner, he said. I think I have something you should see. There was a pause. What kind of something? Brooks asked. The kind that doesn't stay buried. Another pause. Where? Bitterroot Valley. A long exhale came through the line. I'll be there tomorrow. Caleb hung up. He leaned against the cold steel railing and stared down at the river. He wasn't naive. Going public would provoke retaliation. But silence was worse. Atlas nudged his hand gently. You good with this? Caleb asked. Atlas's tail moved once. Back at the farmhouse, Caleb prepared for the next move. He placed discreet cameras near the barn and tree line, positioning them carefully to avoid detection. He reinforced the damaged wall temporarily. He also wrote a formal complaint draft to federal environmental authorities, attaching documented evidence but holding final submission until Brooks arrived to verify. That evening, as darkness fell, a different vehicle approached the logging road. Not Mercer's SUV, a rusted pickup. It stopped at the edge of the property. Deputy Briggs stepped out slowly. He didn't approach the house immediately. Instead, he stood near the tree line, hat in hand. Caleb stepped onto the porch. Atlas remained beside him. Briggs walked forward. I heard you're contacting outside agencies, Briggs said quietly. I am. Briggs nodded slowly. You're not wrong, he admitted after a long silence. But you need to understand something. Iron Ridge funds half this county. Then maybe the county needs new funding, Caleb replied. Briggs's jaw tightened. You're bringing a storm here. It's already here. The deputy looked toward the blackened barn. Mercer's powerful, he said. He won't stop. Caleb held his gaze. I don't intend to. Briggs studied Atlas for a moment. He saved you, the deputy said softly. Caleb nodded. Yes. Briggs exhaled and stepped back. Just make sure you survive long enough to finish this, he said. Then he turned and drove away. The sky cleared that night, revealing stars sharp and cold over the mountains. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb placed the documents into a waterproof case. Atlas lay near the door, despite the discomfort in his shoulder. You don't quit. Caleb murmured. Neither did he. The fire had been meant to scare. Instead, it clarified. This was no longer about property. It was about exposure. And tomorrow, the counterattack would begin. Morning arrived sharp and windless. The sky stretched wide and clear above Bitterroot Valley, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Caleb stood on the porch beside Atlas, watching a plume of dust rise along the logging road. A silver SUV emerged slowly through the trees. Daniel Brooks stepped out first, mid-60s, heavy coat, camera bag slung across one shoulder. His eyes scanned the farmhouse, the scarred barn, the open land. He looked like a man who had seen corruption before. "Caleb Turner?" he called. Caleb nodded once. "That's me." Brooks walked forward, boots crunching in snow. He paused briefly to study Atlas. "That your partner?" he asked. "Yes. Looks like he's seen things." "So have I." Brooks didn't smile. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb laid the documents across the table again. Brooks read silently for a long time. He flipped through Elias's notebook, examined the mineral survey, studied the internal emails. Then he stopped at the barrel markings beneath the floor. "You've confirmed they're still there?" Brooks asked. "Yes. Sealed? For now." Brooks leaned back slowly. "This isn't small-town corruption," he said. "This is federal." "That's the point." Brooks pulled out his camera and began photographing everything: documents, maps, burn marks on the barn, tire tracks captured by Caleb's perimeter cameras. Atlas remained close, watchful but calm. After 2 hours of review, Brooks lowered his camera. "I'll publish," he said, "but once it goes live, there's no pulling it back." Caleb nodded. "I'm not pulling." Brooks studied him. "You prepared for what comes next?" Caleb looked toward the ridge. "I've already seen what comes next." By late afternoon, Brooks drove back toward Helena to file his report. Caleb didn't wait. He finalized the federal complaint and submitted it electronically, attaching copies of every document and time-stamped photos. Then he waited. The response came faster than expected. 2 days later, unmarked federal vehicles rolled into Bitterroot Valley. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Atlas noticed them before Caleb did, ears lifting toward the road. Caleb stepped outside as the vehicles approached. 3 agents stepped out, jackets marked with environmental protection and federal investigation insignias. They introduced themselves briefly and professionally. "We received your submission," the lead agent said. "We'd like to verify." Caleb guided them inside. They photographed the crawl space beneath the floorboards. They recorded the serial numbers stamped onto the barrels. They collected samples carefully and sealed them in evidence containers. The lead agent's expression hardened as he reviewed the markings. "This will trigger a formal investigation," he said. "That's the goal," Caleb replied. Word traveled through town before sunset. By evening, the diner buzzed louder than usual. Grace stood behind the counter, watching news notifications scroll across her phone. Headline: Montana development firm under federal review following environmental allegations. Mercer's name appeared beneath it. At Iron Ridge's main yard on the outskirts of town, federal vehicles arrived just before dawn the next morning. Deputy Briggs stood across the street, hat low over his eyes, watching as agents entered the facility. He didn't interfere. He didn't look away either. Caleb received the call mid-morning. "They're executing search warrants at multiple Iron Ridge properties," Brooks said over the line. "This just went national." Caleb stepped onto the porch and looked across the valley. Atlas stood beside him, tail low but steady. Clouds rolled in slowly over the mountains, dark and heavy. The storm was not weather. It was accountability. By afternoon, Mercer's image appeared on regional news feeds, standing outside his office, jaw tight, declining comment. The county commissioners released a statement distancing themselves from Iron Ridge pending investigation. Deputy Briggs arrived at the farmhouse that evening. He removed his hat as he stepped forward. "I gave a statement," he said quietly. Caleb waited. "I confirmed previous inspection pressures," Briggs continued, "and irregular tax adjustments." Caleb nodded once. "Why?" he asked. Briggs looked toward the mountains. "My father worked that land before Iron Ridge bought him out," he said. "I told myself it was business, but business doesn't burn barns." A long silence passed between them. Atlas moved closer, sniffing Briggs's coat once, then stepping back. "They'll try to fight it," Briggs said. "Mercer has lawyers." "So do federal agencies," Caleb replied. That night, helicopters crossed low over the ridge, heading toward the industrial yard. Red and blue lights flashed faintly in the distance. The valley felt smaller, tighter, but lighter. Caleb stood at the window with Atlas at his side. The farmhouse that no one claimed now stood illuminated by something stronger than fear. Justice. Not complete. Not finished. But moving. Atlas leaned lightly against Caleb's leg. "You did your job," Caleb said quietly. The dog blinked slowly. News alerts continued through the night. Iron Ridge development under federal environmental investigation. Assets frozen pending review. CEO Doyle Mercer under questioning. The storm had broken. And this time, it wasn't fire they brought. It was light. Morning poured across Bitterroot Valley in slow gold ribbons, catching on frost-covered fences and the blackened scar along the barn wall. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, steady and patient, like the ticking of a clock that had finally found its rhythm again. 3 months had passed. Federal investigators had excavated the crawl space beneath the farmhouse. The barrels were removed under careful supervision, documented, and traced back to Iron Ridge's industrial yard. The soil around the western ridge had been sampled, mapped, and secured. Mercer's image had shifted from confident executive to cautious defendant. The valley breathed differently now. Caleb stood near the edge of the property, boots planted firmly in thawing earth. Atlas stood beside him, his coat grown back over the small burn scar on his shoulder. The bandage was gone from his paw. Only a faint limp appeared when he was tired. "You healed up," Caleb murmured. Atlas glanced up, ears alert. A pickup truck rolled slowly up the logging road. But this time, it didn't come in secret. It came invited. 2 men stepped out first, both veterans, both carrying quiet weight in their posture. One wore a worn baseball cap with a unit patch stitched into the side. The other moved carefully, scanning the tree line with instinctive habit. Behind them, Grace Holloway stepped out of her own vehicle, bringing a thermos and a box of homemade bread. "This is what it looks like when people choose sides," she said with a small smile. Caleb nodded once. The farmhouse stood behind them, not fully restored yet, but strengthened. Fresh boards replaced damaged sections. The barn roof had been patched. The porch railing was newly reinforced, but it still carried its scars. And Caleb had chosen not to erase all of them. He wanted the reminder. The men approached him slowly. "You Turner?" the taller one asked. "Yes." "Heard you're building something here." Caleb glanced back at the farmhouse. "I am." Weeks earlier, after Mercer's indictment and the freezing of Iron Ridge's assets, the county had issued a public apology regarding manipulated tax assessments. The land was cleared of false debt. Lithium rights were placed under environmental review, preventing any immediate extraction. But Caleb had already decided. He wasn't selling. He wasn't mining. He wasn't leaving. He was building. Inside the farmhouse, one room had been cleared and repainted. Cots lined the walls temporarily. A wood stove had been installed. A small sign rested above the doorframe. Turner Retreat for veterans seeking quiet. Atlas walked through the doorway first, tail steady, posture confident. The veterans followed. Caleb watched as they stepped inside, not as visitors, but as men searching for something steadier than noise. Later that afternoon, Caleb stood alone near the river bridge where he had once made that first phone call. The water moved freely now beneath melting ice. Atlas stood beside him again, watching the current. "You know," Caleb said quietly, "I thought this place was just a fight." Atlas's ears shifted. "But it wasn't," Caleb continued. "It was a chance." The wind moved gently through the pines. Behind them, voices carried faintly from the farmhouse. Grace laughing softly, one of the veterans asking about the barn repairs. Community, not isolation. Caleb rested a hand against Atlas's shoulder. "You pulled me out of a fire," he said. Atlas leaned into him. "But you also pulled me into something better." As the sun lowered over the valley, the farmhouse caught warm light across its windows. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, no longer a threat, but a signal of life. Deputy Briggs arrived briefly near dusk, hat in hand. "County's finalizing a small grant," he said, "for rehabilitation support services. You'll have to file paperwork." Caleb allowed himself a small smile. "I'll manage." Briggs nodded once. "Your father would have been proud," he added quietly. Caleb looked toward the ridge. "I hope so." When darkness settled, it felt different than before. Not heavy, not watchful. Peaceful. Atlas lay near the porch steps, watching the stars emerge one by one. Caleb sat beside him. The farmhouse no one claimed now held voices. Laughter. Purpose. The land that had been targeted for exploitation now carried something steadier. Healing. Caleb inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with cold mountain air. He no longer slept under bridges. He no longer drifted from shelter to shelter. He slept beneath Montana skies with walls that meant something. The inheritance had never been debt. It had been responsibility. And in choosing to fight, he had chosen to stay. Atlas lifted his head and looked toward the house, then back at Caleb. Ready. Always ready. The farmhouse stood behind them, not watching. Standing. If you believe a man has the right to protect his land and stand up for what's buried beneath it, type yes in the comments. And if you've ever had to fight quietly for what was yours, share your state so we can see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you value stories about justice, grit, and neighbors who refuse to back down. There's more coming from the land of the free.